Hi, Rama. We're in week 1, day 3 of our Bible reading plan. Today we're in Genesis chapter 3. We're all familiar with this passage. It tells us of the fall of man. But to understand chapter 3, we again need to go back to the end of chapter 2, where we saw that the man and his wife were both naked and not ashamed. This shows the state of holiness that they were in, the state of purity, and yet we know that that ends here in chapter 3. We begin in chapter 3 by meeting a serpent, who's later identified in the New Testament as Satan himself. Satan comes to Eve and tempts her, questioning what God has said. Did God actually say, "You shall not eat of the tree in the garden"? And the woman replies to the serpent, but then she actually adds to what God had said. God had said, "Don't eat of the tree." But Eve says, God said we shouldn't touch it either. Eve is adding to what God has said. And then Satan continues to tempt Eve and says, "Come on, if you do this, you're not going to die. For God knows that if you do this, you'll be like him." Now remember that God had already made Adam and Eve in his image. God had given them everything they need, but Satan convinced Eve that there was something she was lacking. There was something else that she needed, and if she would just disobey God, she would actually be even more like him. So Eve, being deceived, actually takes of the fruit and eats it. Now, Eve was deceived, but Adam wasn't. Eve takes the fruit to Adam, and he eats of it as well. He willfully did it. He knew what God had said, and he still let his wife fall into sin, and he himself willingly sinned against God. And when that happened, they realized their nakedness. When we see chapter 2:24 that they were naked and not ashamed, we can't imagine what that's like, because ever since the fall of man, we know that nakedness is associated with shamefulness. But there was a season when it wasn't. But now Adam and Eve have sinned, and they understand. Their eyes were opened. They recognize that they are sinful before God, and they try to cover their sins. They try with fig leaves. The moment that you take a leaf off of a tree, it's already beginning to die. Their coverings will not last. God comes to them in the garden, and he asks them, "Where are you?" Not because God doesn't know where they are, because they needed to recognize where they were. They were separated from God, and they were trying to cover up their own sins, and it won't work. They pass the blame on to one another, and eventually God begins to speak. They've spoken enough, and now God is going to speak. And first he speaks to the serpent, and he says something very important in verse 15, chapter 3 of verse 15 of Genesis. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Here we have the very earliest glimpses of the gospel, that there's going to be war between Eve's offspring, and Satan. But out of Eve's offspring will come one who will ultimately crush the head of the serpent. But that serpent is going to bruise the heel. He's going to injure the offspring of Eve. We see here that as God continues to give the curses, to explain to them the effects of their sin, he says, these things that were already planned for you, that were not going to be difficult, they're now going to be difficult. When Eve gives birth, it will be painful. And all women can attest to that. All who have given birth will say, absolutely, this is the effect of the fall. And Adam is told that because you've listened not to the voice of God, but you've listened to your wife who was led into deceit, you've listened to her, you've eaten of the tree that I told you not to, here's what's going to happen to you. That as you work, thorns and thistles will come from the ground. You were supposed to work the ground. You're supposed to tend and keep the garden, but now it's going to be difficult. By the sweat of your face, you shall eat your bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Adam and Eve were made to create, to have offspring, but that's going to be difficult. They were made to work. Work was not made to be difficult in the beginning, but now because of sin, work will be very difficult. And we also see that Eve is the mother of all living. That's the significance of her name. And I must just pause and say that that reminds us that we're all one race, that God has made all people out of Adam and Eve, and there should be no division among us because of who we come from. We all come from Adam and Eve. But we see that God covers Adam and Eve. They took fig leaves and tried to cover their sin, but God makes a sacrifice. God takes an animal and covers them. And so even in Genesis chapter 3, we have the hope It comes from verse 15, knowing that one day an offspring will come who will crush the serpent, and it's foreshadowed even in that covering that God gives to Adam and Eve, that their sin must be covered, and that one day God will send his Son to be able to cover their sins. This is a summary. For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.